Hey everyone, my name's Rachel, and today we're going to be talking about a topic that I first stumbled across on a blog that I've spoken about before called Lies Young Women Believe. This was a particular article called Should Christians Take Antidepressants? And it kind of opened up this huge kind of wormhole for me to fall down and research, and I ended up reading loads and loads of stuff. And it propelled me into this crazy world known as Nouthetic Counselling. Now I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I tried to watch a load of videos, see how it's pronounced, and I think it's Nouthetic, even though a part of me wants to say Nouthetic. I think it's Nouthetic. Anyway, according to Wikipedia, Nouthetic Counselling is a form of evangelical Protestant pastoral counselling based solely upon the Bible and focused on Christ. If we want to put it really simply, it claims that psychiatry, psychology, and even medicating mental illnesses does nothing to actually help them because they're purely spiritual issues, and so only belief in the Bible and God can cure them. Nothing else. It's not a physical issue according to these people. Now I want to stress, before I go any further and before I get into the bulk of this video, that the people who believe in this stuff, it's a really small minority of certain fundamentalist Christians who believe this. It's not all Christians, it's not all religious people. I also found a vast amount of wonderful resources from other Christian preachers and bloggers claiming that while the church may offer support to people with mental health issues, they still understand that often traditional treatments such as medication and counselling and therapy are also important. They do stress that. I mean, my sister-in-law, I've spoken about her before, but she is both a Christian and a GP. And she regularly prescribes antidepressants and other medications when necessary to people. So this isn't all Christians I'm talking about, this isn't all religious people, I just want to stress that again. I will say that I am an atheist and I'm trying to offer a kind of atheist perspective in this conversation. And as always, I have no issues with religious people who aren't harming or oppressing anyone else. But this video is about a certain group of people who do identify as Christians, who are behaving in a way that I think is dangerous. And that does make me mad, and that does make me worry for a lot of people, and that's why I want to talk about it today. So now that's out of the way, I want to talk a little bit about kind of mental health issues in general. The big one I'm probably going to be talking about today is clinical depression. Depression is a super complicated issue, just like most mental health problems. It can have a large number of triggers, it can last varying lengths of time, it can kind of have different symptoms in different people, and it can require a huge range of treatments. It's not really simple and straightforward at all. Clinical depression can present as low mood, low energy, not sleeping, oversleeping, disinterest in things you once found interesting, or things that you used to enjoy. It can affect your eating habits. It can just affect how you see the world, and there's this whole range of symptoms. It can be triggered by traumatic events. It could be triggered by seemingly nothing. As I said, it's very, very complicated. But the one thing we can say about depression is that even though it's classed as a mental illness, it is physiological. It's not just in your head, if that makes sense. There are physical things happening. Something goes wrong in the brain or something isn't working as it should. It does differ in people, and that's why there's a whole range of treatments and why some work on some people and some work on others. And that's also why most people receive more than one type of treatment at a time. For example, some people might take medication and see a counsellor. Some people might get better by just seeing a therapist. You know, there's lots and lots of different things. To put it all very, very simply, a lot of people with depression show signs of abnormalities in how chemicals interact in the brain, usually, neurotransmitters and hormones. There might be decreased activity in certain parts of the brain, especially the ones to do with emotional information processing. And a lot of studies tend to focus on specific neurotransmitters like serotonin or norepinephrine or dopamine, and how often the brain either doesn't produce enough, or certain neurons don't know how to uptake enough, and so on. Now, there's still plenty of research being done. There's nothing set in stone stating that all people with depression are lacking X, Y, and Z neurotransmitters. There's nothing saying that this part of the brain doesn't work well. There's nothing saying that this always happens. But there's definitely evidence that people with all types of depression, physiological things are happening. They're actual problems with the brain. And there's also evidence that medications such as SSRIs, which is probably the most common antidepressant, that's selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, there's a lot of evidence to say that these do have a positive effect on a large number of people suffering from depression, and there's evidence to suggest that other medications also work on certain people. So I probably sound like I'm talking really vaguely here, and that's because I kind of am, because this stuff is far too complicated to completely fit into one tiny part of one tiny video. But the point that I want to get across is that with illnesses like depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions, they do have physical effects, physical causes, physical consequences. And that means that treatments, including medication, are sometimes necessary, as are proven counselling and therapy techniques, whether it's just being able to talk to someone, whether it's something a little bit more structured like cognitive behavioural therapy, and so on. I'll say it again, different treatments work differently on different people. And while talking with a therapist may be enough for one person, another person may need medication to be able to see any improvements. So, to summarise, 1, you can't make any generalisations about people with mental health issues. 2, you can't rule out the fact that medications do work for a large number of people. And 3, while mental health problems may seem to be purely mental or spiritual, they're actually deeply connected to physical stuff that's happening in your brain and body. And that's a really important thing to remember as we talk about the next thing, which is Nouthetic Counselling. So as I said, Nouthetic Counselling revolves around certain fundamentalist groups of Christians, Protestants, whatever they want to call themselves. And they try and treat mental illnesses, and yet they have this fundamental misunderstanding of what a mental illness is. The Institute for Nouthetic Studies write on their website that you need to understand that apart from injuries, tumours and other brain problems, there's no such thing as a mental illness. How could a non-organic entity, whatever it may be, cause a non-organic illness? The very idea is preposterous. It is the body that becomes ill. Don't be deceived by medical terminology used to describe a non-medical problem. On the surface, this may seem fair enough to some people. And you're right, it is the body that becomes ill, and when the body's ill, that needs treating. And you shouldn't try and throw medicine at non-medical problems. But when you dig around on the rest of the site, it becomes clear that they don't believe that, clinical depression is a physical or medical problem. And that's very problematic. In one particular blog post, they write that depression is allowing how one feels, what one thinks, or what one's circumstances are to become one's reason to cease functioning in some aspect of life that God expects of us otherwise. It is a form of unbelief which says God is not sufficient for my situation. And this is a clear misunderstanding of what depression is. It belittles the seriousness of the illness, and it makes it seem like it's a choice for people, which it definitely is not. I don't know one person who suffered from depression who would say, oh yeah, I chose to be this way. If you've had it, if you're suffering from it now, or know someone who has in the past, you know how horrific it can be, and I don't think anyone would choose to be in that state. It's ridiculous. You can't help being ill. You can't help if your brain isn't working properly. You can't help having a brain tumour any more than you can help having depression or anxiety or some other mental illness. The way they speak about depression and other illnesses like this is not only disgusting and disrespectful, but it's counterproductive. No one's going to get better when they're told, and again I quote from the website, the individual who is depressed is the cause of his own depression by how he evaluates each of these occasions and responds to them. He sinfully neglects a God-given responsibility because he feels bad. His dog died, he lost his job, or any number of other reasons. It is this cycle of ever-increasing sinful responses to ever-increasing sinful choices that is the cause of depression. This makes me so angry, it really does. If anything, this is going to make the person who is already suffering feel worse. It's genuinely going to hinder their recovery. I mean, to a rational person, looking at this literally reads as the individual who has a chemical imbalance in their brain is the cause of the chemical imbalance in their brain because he neglects God. And that just makes it sound silly, because it is silly. But the scary thing is that the people who wrote this thoroughly believe in what they're saying. They thoroughly believe that depression isn't anything to do with brain chemistry or the physiological stuff going on in your brain. They just think it's all to do with ignoring God or being sinful or feeling bad about it. it's not just a misunderstanding. The people writing this have a willful rejection of facts and science. And it's not just one website either. The Association of Certified Biblical Counselors writes that mental illness does not really exist. And these are people that other people who are suffering or vulnerable, they might be ill, they might be in need of something. Those people come to this website and come to these certified biblical counselors needing help and assistance, and they turn around and say things like mental illness does not exist. And I can't overstate how harmful that is, really. They go on to say that mental illness is not a disease in the way that tuberculosis or hepatitis is. Mental illness is more in the realm of what social scientists call a construct, a relatively abstract idea that gets informed by the shifting opinions of various people. Mental illness is not really a thing. They argue that psychologists, and apparently doctors too, do not believe that people are spiritual beings who live all of their life under the authority of God who made them and holds them accountable. Denying the divine and the spiritual requires them to see all problems as physical and organic in nature. Worry isn't sinful. It is an organic mental illness that requires medical intervention. Sorrow isn't spiritual. It is a medical problem that requires a pharmacological solution. As Christians, we know better. This is so potentially harmful. You're telling people to ignore things that are physically wrong with them. Again, claiming that as Christians, who may or may not be qualified in anything, you have some authority over doctors and scientists, psychologists who spent years studying and understanding and learning about these things. I mean, let's just be real for a second, right? Whether you see worry as a sin or not doesn't matter, because whether you want it to be or not, it is a physical thing. Yes, it's an emotion, but when you feel worry, there are electrochemical signals whizzing around your brain, and yes, I'm speaking in very simplified terms again. But there are certain parts of your brain being stimulated, and there are certain parts of your brain being inhibited. There are certain hormones being released in your brain and in other parts of your body. There might be signals being sent to other parts of your body, for example, telling the heart rate to increase, or making you sweat, or speeding up your metabolism. All of this builds to create and express the feeling of worry, right? Yes, it's an emotion, it's a feeling, whatever you want to call it, but it's not separate from the body. It is physiological on some level, and you cannot deny that. To try and deny that is willfully spreading misinformation to suit their own agenda, and that's what websites like, these biblical counselors, that's what they're doing. This particular site goes on to talk about treatment, saying, Jesus can heal these problems. In fact, his is the only healing available. Our culture believes that mental illness points to biology and requires medical intervention. But maybe that's because they do often require medical intervention. Not always, but often. You can't just ignore the cases where medication has helped people. Those of us in the biblical counselling movement are the only ones who know that the construct of mental illness actually has to do with the problems of the heart and require the gospel of God's grace for healing. And I find this statement very interesting, because you know how often certain Christians will come to us atheists and they'll say, oh my god, you're being so prideful, it's so arrogant, blah blah blah. Isn't this exactly what they're doing when they say we are the only ones who know? Isn't that exactly what that is? That's being pretty prideful, I think. It's strange. But anyway, this annoys me because not only is it spreading this dangerous misinformation, but it's creating a sense of reliance. Vulnerable victims, people suffering from mental health issues, like I say, they are vulnerable, and they're most likely scared, they're probably feeling alone, and here you are telling them we're the only ones who can help you. And again, it's religious people playing on fear and dependency, and it's disgusting, and it's dangerous, and it's harmful. You know, the interesting thing is that I don't actually have that much of an issue with the kind of treatments they offer. A lot of the time it's just about helping people to understand how they're feeling now and empowering them and teaching them what the Bible says, and if you're into that and it helps you get better, then I'm all for it. But it's a complete rejection of actual medicine and science and the need to make people dependent on them. That's what I have the issue with, and it's a pretty big issue I have because it's a pretty big problem. And that's why I'm against this kind of counselling, and that's why it angers me so much. I mean, while I'm an atheist and wouldn't get anything out of being told, well, the Bible says this, this, and this, I did do some research on what other Christians feel about mental health issues, and there are people out there who are far, far more reasonable. I found this one blog post by a Christian called, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Josh Tice, which was very interesting. In it, he talks about how he once believed that those taking antidepressants or other medication for mental illnesses were dishonouring God. His words, he told people they were dishonouring God. However, he goes on to talk about how he was actually pulled aside by a deacon who challenged his preconceived ideas of mental illness and emotional health. He claimed that the deacon walked him through the medical realities of which I was unaware. One line which really stuck out to me was when he writes, "One forgets that just as the pancreas can have problems producing insulin, the brain can have chemical imbalances too," which I think is a pretty fantastic summary and really explains a lot. But this is just one example of a Christian being kind of proactive about mental health and understanding that medication is sometimes important, and as is traditional counselling and therapy. There are many more out there who go on to promote going to see a doctor, taking medication if you need it, going to see a counsellor, and they remind people that through it all, the church and the church community, or whatever religion they're a part of, will be there to support them if and when they need it. And I think that's a pretty brilliant thing. Anyway, I just kind of want to end this video with a bit of a plea to anyone out there who might be religious or whatever, or even not religious, but to stay away from people like these Nouthetic counsellors, because while ultimately their goal may be to help people with mental health issues, I honestly feel that their messages and how they deliver them are dangerous and could very easily, and probably do more harm than good. Doctors, psychiatrists, scientists who studied this should not be belittled. Mental health issues in general should not be belittled. Someone who's ill should never be told this is your fault, and they should never be told your illness isn't real. They should never be told, well, it's your choice because you did something wrong. If you need medication, that's not something to be ashamed of, and it's not something you should be pushed away from. Mental illnesses, despite the name, are very physical and they're very real. They're not a choice, and as I said, no one should ever be made to feel like it's their fault. But anyway, so I just want to talk a little bit about this idea of like Nouthetic counselling and how dangerous and harmful I think it is, and just kind of bring it to the forefront of conversation a bit more, because I'd like to hear your thoughts on this and whether you agree with me. Do you think it is as harmful as I think it is, or I don't know, am I just kind of blowing this out of proportion? I don't know, let me know your thoughts down in the comments. But for now, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. I'll see you again soon.